In the early 1800s, China was a giant. It saw itself as the center of the world. It was a proud and powerful empire with a long, rich history. The Qing dynasty ruled over this vast land. They had a strong economy based on farming and making beautiful goods. Things like silk, porcelain, and tea were famous everywhere. The Chinese emperor believed he was the ruler of all under heaven. He thought other countries should show respect and bring gifts, or tribute. This was how China had dealt with foreigners for centuries. It was a system that worked for them, and they saw no reason to change it. They felt they had everything they needed and were not interested in what the West had to offer. On the other side of the world, Britain was a rising power. It was a small island nation, but it had big ambitions. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Factories were producing huge amounts of goods. Britain had a mighty navy that sailed the world's oceans, protecting its trade routes and colonies. This was the age of empire, and Britain wanted to be the biggest and best. British merchants were eager to find new markets to sell their products. They also wanted to buy goods from other countries, especially from China. But they found it very difficult to trade with the proud and self-sufficient Chinese empire. These two very different worlds were on a collision course. China was old and confident in its ways. It wanted to keep foreigners at a distance. Britain was young, aggressive, and hungry for profit. It wanted to open China up to trade, by any means necessary. The British believed in free trade, the idea that they should be able to buy and sell goods anywhere they wanted. The Chinese government did not agree. They controlled trade very carefully. They only allowed foreigners to trade in one city, Guangzhou, which was also known as Canton. This created a lot of tension between the two nations. This clash of cultures and economies set the stage for a dark chapter in history. The British found a product that they could sell to China, a product that would change everything. This product was opium, a dangerous and addictive drug. The story of the Opium Wars is not just about trade or battles. It is the story of how one nation used a powerful drug to bend another nation to its will. It is a shocking tale of greed, addiction, and war. It shows how far Britain was willing to go to force its way into China, leaving a trail of destruction and resentment that would last for more than a century. The British people had fallen in love with a drink from China tea. By the 1800s, tea was no longer a luxury for the rich. It had become a daily necessity for people of all classes across Britain. Millions of pounds of tea were imported from China every year. The British East India Company, a powerful trading firm, had a monopoly on this trade. They sent ships filled with silver to China to buy tea, silk, and porcelain. The Chinese were happy to sell their goods, but they were not interested in buying much from Britain. They felt British products, like woolen textiles, were of poor quality and not suited to their needs. This created a huge trade imbalance. A massive amount of silver was flowing out of Britain and into China. This was a serious problem for the British economy. Silver was the basis of their currency, and they were losing it at an alarming rate. British officials and merchants became desperate to find something that the Chinese would want to buy. They needed a product that could reverse the flow of silver. They tried to sell clocks, telescopes, and other manufactured goods, but the Chinese market remained uninterested. The Chinese economy was largely self-sufficient, and they simply did not need what the British were selling. The British East India Company controlled large parts of India. It was there that they found their solution. Farmers in India grew opium poppies in vast fields. Opium is a powerful drug made from the juice of these poppies. It is highly addictive, and has been used for centuries as a painkiller. The company realized that they could produce opium cheaply in India and sell it for a huge profit in China. This was their answer to the silver problem. By selling opium, they could finally get the silver back from China. And so they began a massive, illegal drug trafficking operation. The company was clever about how they did this. They did not sell the opium directly. Instead, they sold it to private traders and smugglers at auctions in Calcutta. These private traders, many of them British and American, would then smuggle the drug into China. The opium was packed onto fast, heavily armed ships called clippers. These ships would sail to the coast of China and meet with Chinese smugglers in smaller boats. The smugglers would then distribute the drug throughout the country. It was a dirty business, but it was incredibly profitable. The silver that once flowed into China to pay for tea now flowed back out to pay for opium. The British plan worked better than they could have ever imagined. The demand for opium in China exploded. At first it was used by the wealthy elite as a recreational drug, but soon its use spread to all levels of society. Soldiers, government officials, merchants, and even poor laborers became addicted. The drug offered a temporary escape from the hardships of life. But this escape came at a terrible price. The addiction was powerful and destructive. People who were once productive members of society became consumed by their need for the drug. They would do anything to get their next fix. The social consequences were devastating. Families were torn apart. Addicts sold their possessions, their homes, and even their children to pay for opium. Crime rates soared as people stole to support their habit. Productivity dropped as workers and farmers were too sick or too high to do their jobs. The government became riddled with corruption. Officials who were supposed to stop the drug trade were often addicts themselves. Others took bribes from smugglers to look the other way. The entire fabric of Chinese society began to unravel. The flowery flag devils, as the British were called, were poisoning the nation from within. The economic impact was just as severe. The trade imbalance that Britain had worried about was now reversed. China, which had once been a magnet for the world's silver, was now hemorrhaging it. Huge amounts of silver flowed out of the country to pay for the imported opium. This caused a silver shortage, which led to a major economic crisis. The value of silver went up, while the value of copper coins, the currency used by ordinary people, went down. This meant that peasants had to pay their taxes in silver, but they earned their money in copper. Their tax burden became heavier and heavier, pushing many into poverty and ruin. The Qing government watched in horror as their country was consumed by this drug epidemic. The emperor and his advisors knew they had to do something. The opium trade was not just draining their economy, it was destroying their people and undermining their authority. It was a threat to the very survival of the dynasty. They had issued edicts banning opium many times before, but these had been largely ignored. The profits were too great and the corruption was too deep. Now they realized that they needed to take much stronger action. The stage was set for a dramatic and violent confrontation. In 1839, the Daoguang Emperor decided he had seen enough. He was determined to wipe out the opium trade once and for all. To lead this campaign, he chose a highly respected and incorruptible official named Lin Zexu. Lin was given extraordinary powers and sent to the southern port of Canton, the center of the illegal drug trade. He was a man on a mission. He arrived with a clear goal: to stop the flow of opium into China and to help the addicts recover. He was known for his integrity and his strong sense of moral duty, and he took his new role very seriously. Upon arriving in Canton, Lin Zexu wasted no time. He began by cracking down on the Chinese side of the trade. He arrested thousands of Chinese dealers and corrupt officials. He confiscated their opium pipes and shut down the opium dens where people gathered to smoke. He also set up programs to help addicts quit the drug. But his main target was the foreign merchants who were bringing the poison into his country. He wrote an open letter to Queen Victoria of Great Britain, appealing to her conscience. He asked how Britain could sell a drug that was illegal in its own country to the people of China. He received no reply. Lin then took a much more aggressive step. He ordered all foreign traders in Canton to hand over their entire stock of opium. The merchants, led by the British Superintendent of Trade, Charles Elliot, refused. They thought Lin was bluffing. In response, Lin blockaded the foreign factories, which were the residential and business compounds where the traders lived. He cut off their food and water supplies and surrounded them with Chinese troops. For 6 weeks, the foreigners were trapped. They were not allowed to leave until they surrendered the opium. It was a tense standoff that brought the two nations to the brink of war. Faced with this immense pressure, Charles Elliot finally gave in. He ordered the British merchants to surrender all their opium to Lin Zexu. In total, over 20,000 chests of opium were handed over. This was a massive amount, equivalent to more than 1 million kilograms of the drug. To show the world that China was serious about ending the trade, Lin decided to destroy it all publicly. The chests were taken to the beach at Human. Workers dug 3 huge trenches, filled them with water and lime, and then dumped the opium in. For 23 days they stirred the mixture until the drug was completely destroyed. It was a powerful statement, but it was also the act that would light the fuse for war. So, the news of the destroyed opium and the confinement of British citizens reached London. The merchants who had lost their valuable cargo were honestly outraged. They demanded compensation from their government. Pretty soon, a powerful pro-war lobby, supported by manufacturers who wanted to open up the Chinese market, started pushing hard for military action. They argued that China had insulted the British flag and violated the principles of free trade. But, they painted the conflict not as a war to protect the drug trade but as a defense of national honor and commercial rights. After a heated debate in Parliament, the British government decided to send a military expedition to China. In June of 1840, a fleet of British warships and steam-powered gunboats arrived off the coast of China. This marked the beginning of the First Opium War. It was, in reality, a completely one-sided conflict. The British had a modern, industrial-age military. Their ships were fast, maneuverable, and equipped with powerful cannons that could fire from a long distance. Their soldiers were armed with advanced percussion cap rifles. The Chinese military, on the other hand, was kind of stuck in the past. Their navy consisted of traditional wooden junks, which were no match for the British steamships. Their soldiers used outdated muskets and fought with swords and spears. The British strategy was to use their naval superiority to strike at key points along the Chinese coast. They easily captured coastal cities and sailed up major rivers like the Yangtze and the Pearl River. They blockaded important ports, crippling China's internal trade and tax collection system. The Chinese forces, despite their bravery and superior numbers, were overwhelmed by British firepower. Every battle followed a similar pattern. The British would bombard Chinese forts from a safe distance with their cannons. Then, they would land their troops, who would quickly overwhelm the defenders. The technological gap was simply too large to overcome. One of the key moments of the war was the British capture of Zhoushan, an island off the coast. This was followed by attacks on other strategic cities. The Qing court was in shock. They just could not understand how a small force of barbarians could defeat their mighty empire so easily. They tried to negotiate, but the British demands were just too high. The war continued, with the British advancing further and further into China. The climax came in 1842, when a British fleet sailed up the Yangtze River and threatened to attack the ancient and vital city of Nanjing. This move threatened to cut the empire in two, forcing the emperor to finally admit defeat. The First Opium War had been a disaster for China, but the story was not over. The Treaty of Nanjing left many issues unresolved. The British were not fully satisfied. They wanted even more access to China. They wanted to legalize the opium trade completely, open all of China to their merchants, and establish a permanent ambassador in Beijing. The Qing court, on the other hand, tried its best to resist these further demands. They dragged their feet on implementing the treaty and tried to limit foreign influence as much as possible. This created a fragile and tense peace that was bound to break. The excuse for another war came in 1856. Chinese officials in Canton boarded a ship called the Arrow. The ship was registered in Hong Kong and was flying a British flag, although its registration had expired. The Chinese officials arrested the Chinese crew, accusing them of piracy and smuggling. The British consul in Canton, Harry Parkes, used this incident as a pretext for military action. He claimed that the Chinese had insulted the British flag. At the same time, France decided to join Britain. Their excuse was the execution of a French missionary in a part of China where he was not allowed to be. Together, Britain and France launched a new war against China. This conflict, known as the Second Opium War or the Arrow War, was even more brutal than the first. The Anglo-French forces were once again technologically superior. They quickly captured Canton and then sailed north to threaten the capital, Beijing. In 1858, they forced the Chinese to sign another treaty, the Treaty of Tientsin. This treaty granted most of their demands, including the opening of more ports and the right to have diplomats in Beijing. However, the emperor's court in Beijing was reluctant to ratify the treaty. When foreign diplomats tried to travel to Beijing to exchange the signed copies, they were fired upon by Chinese forts. This act of defiance led to the final, most humiliating phase of the war. In 1860, a larger and more powerful Anglo-French force marched on Beijing. The Chinese emperor fled the capital. In an act of pure vandalism and revenge, the British and French troops looted and burned the magnificent summer palaces. These were a vast complex of beautiful palaces, gardens, and temples filled with priceless art and cultural treasures. The destruction of the summer palaces was a deliberate act designed to punish the emperor and break the spirit of the Chinese nation. It was a barbaric act that left a deep and lasting scar on the Chinese psyche. The war ended with China's complete and utter defeat. The end of the wars marked the beginning of a new era for China, an era defined by what became known as the Unequal treaties. The first and most famous of these was the Treaty of Nanjing, signed in 1842 after the First War. This treaty was not a negotiation between equals, it was a list of demands forced upon a defeated nation. Under its terms, China was forced to pay a huge sum of money to Britain to cover the cost of the war and to compensate for the destroyed opium. This was a bitter pill to swallow. China had to pay the drug dealer for the drugs it had destroyed. The treaty also forced China to open 5 ports to foreign trade. These were Canton, Shanghai, Xiamen, Fuzhou, and Ningbo. In these treaty ports, British merchants could live and trade freely under the protection of their own laws. This was a principle called extraterritoriality, which meant that British citizens in China were not subject to Chinese law. If they committed a crime, they would be tried by their own consular courts. This was a direct violation of Chinese sovereignty and a source of constant friction. The treaty also required China to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity, giving them a permanent base on the Chinese coast. The treaties that followed the Second Opium War were even more punishing. The Convention of Beijing, signed in 1860, legalized the opium trade. The very thing China had fought to prevent was now forced upon it. More ports were opened to foreign trade, including ports deep inside the country along the Yangtze River. Foreigners were given the right to travel freely throughout China. Christian missionaries were granted the right to preach and own property anywhere in the country. This led to cultural clashes and resentment among the local population. China also had to pay another massive indemnity to both Britain and France. These treaties effectively stripped China of its independence. They created a system where foreign powers could exploit China's economy and resources without any real opposition. Other Western powers like the United States, Russia, and Germany soon demanded similar treaties, creating their own spheres of influence. China was being carved up like a melon. The Qing government was too weak to resist. For the next century, China would be trapped in a semi-colonial state, unable to control its own trade, territory, or laws. The unequal treaties were a constant reminder of the nation's weakness and humiliation. The Opium Wars and the treaties that followed plunged China into a period that is now known as the Century of Humiliation. This period, lasting from roughly 1839 to 1949, was a time of immense suffering, political chaos, and foreign domination. The wars shattered China's long-held belief that it was the superior civilization at the center of the world. The defeat at the hands of a small Western nation was a profound psychological shock. It exposed the deep-seated weakness of the Qing dynasty and the backwardness of its traditional institutions. The once proud empire was now seen as the sick man of Asia. The legalization of opium after the Second Opium War had catastrophic consequences. The drug flooded the country, and addiction became even more widespread. The social and economic problems that had started before the wars only got worse. The country was weakened from within, making it easier for foreign powers to exert their influence. The Qing government was unable to stop the decay. Its authority was crippled, and it was burdened with massive debts from the war indemnities. This weakness led to a series of internal rebellions, the most devastating of which was the Taiping Rebellion, a massive civil war that killed millions of people. The humiliation of the Opium Wars sparked a desire for change among some Chinese intellectuals and officials. They realized that China had to modernize if it was to survive. This led to a series of reform movements such as the self-strengthening movement. The goal was to adopt Western technology, especially military technology, while preserving traditional Chinese culture and values. However, these reforms were often half-hearted and met with resistance from conservative elements in the court. The attempts to modernize were ultimately not enough to save the dynasty from collapse in 1911. The legacy of this period is deeply ingrained in modern China's national identity. The narrative of the Century of Humiliation is taught in every school. It is a story of a great nation being victimized and exploited by imperialist powers. It fuels a strong sense of nationalism and a desire to restore China to its rightful place as a strong and respected global power. This history helps to explain China's deep suspicion of the West and its fierce determination to protect its sovereignty and national interests. The memory of the Opium Wars is a powerful force that continues to shape China's view of the world today. The story of the Opium Wars is a sobering and important lesson from history. It is a stark reminder of the destructive power of greed and the dark side of colonialism. It shows how a powerful nation driven by economic interests used an addictive drug as a tool of foreign policy. Great Britain, a country that saw itself as a beacon of civilization, engaged in what was essentially state-sponsored drug trafficking on a massive scale. This shocking policy was designed to force open the doors of a resistant nation, and it succeeded, but at a terrible human cost. The wars were not about honor or free trade, they were about protecting the profits from the opium trade. For China, the Opium Wars were a national trauma. They marked the end of its long isolation and the beginning of a painful century of foreign domination and internal turmoil. The wars exposed the vulnerabilities of a proud but stagnant empire, and forced it onto a long and difficult path toward modernization. The legacy of these conflicts, the unequal treaties, the loss of territory, and the deep sense of national shame, has had a profound and lasting impact. It fueled the revolutions that would eventually overthrow the old imperial system and give rise to the China we see today, a nation driven by a powerful desire never to be weak or humiliated again. The Opium Wars also fundamentally changed the relationship between China and the West. They established a pattern of interaction based on force and inequality. This legacy of mistrust and resentment has echoed through the generations and continues to influence geopolitical dynamics. The history of the wars serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of imperialism and the importance of mutual respect in international relations. It highlights the hypocrisy of Western powers who preached about civilization and morality while engaging in deeply immoral acts for profit and power. Looking back, we can see that the Opium Wars were a turning point in world history. They were a brutal clash between an old agrarian empire and a new industrial one. The outcome demonstrated the immense power that technology and aggressive commercial ambition could unleash. The story is a complex one, with lessons for all. It reminds us of the devastating human consequences of the global drug trade and the ease with which economic motives can be dressed up in the language of high principle. It is a dark chapter that should not be forgotten, as it holds important lessons about power, justice, and the foundations of our modern world.